Charleston, South Carolina. The morning air hung thick with humidity, dense enough to slow time. The city stirred under a blanket of quiet, the kind born not of peace, but of long-simmering tension. Spanish moss draped low from the live oaks outside the courthouse, their branches curling like watchful fingers. The neoclassical columns of the building rose into the haze, defiant and unmoved by centuries of protest and apology. The marble steps had seen processions of power, some noble, some not. Inside, the courthouse echoed with the metallic click of shoes on polished tile. It was early, too early for spectators, just early enough for discomfort to slip through unnoticed. Judge Clara May walked those halls like a woman with ghosts in her shadow. At 62, she wore her years as armor, silver streaks in her hair pulled tight, every step measured but unhurried, her brown eyes scanning the space with quiet calculation. She wasn't in her robe yet, just a dark blazer, tailored and precise, with a file folder tucked beneath one arm. The courtroom she entered should have been like any other, routine, mundane. A vandalism case. A teenage defendant, a clerk nodding stiffly. But something in the air had shifted. Sergeant Travis Boone was already inside. He stood at the prosecution table, arms folded like barriers, his gaze fixed not on the boy he'd arrested, but on the wall beyond. Boone, mid-40s, clean-cut, the kind of white man whose badge had never known a day of consequence. He didn't look up when Clara entered, not really. His eyes passed over her, unseeing, a woman out of context. No robe, no gavel, just another body in a space he considered his. "Let's get this started," he barked, voice thick with entitlement. Clara paused, her tone even. "I suggest you find the time." The way he turned to her then, half sneer, half confusion, was not new to Clara. She had seen that look in courtrooms and backrooms her entire career, disbelief that a woman like her could exist outside his control. "You here for the defense?" he asked. She didn't respond, just moved to the side table. Picked up the case file. The clerk's throat clicked as she swallowed. Then, impact. A crack, sharp as a starter pistol. His hand. Her cheek. The sound rang out like a shot across silence, and then came the stillness. No one moved. Not the clerk, not the teenage boy in the defense chair, not even the overhead lights. For a moment, it felt like the world had been paused mid-breath. A collective recoil. Clara didn't touch her face. She didn't speak. She simply turned, slowly, until her eyes met his. Boone's smirk was already fading, dissolving into something less defined, something unsure. "You people need to learn some respect," he muttered. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Another, "Did he just?" Clara stepped forward. The air grew heavy. No sound but her heels on tile. Boone puffed up, the animal in him sensing challenge. "I don't care who you think you are," he snapped. "You don't get to walk into my courtroom and act." Her voice cut clean through him. "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" The shift was instant. Audible. The clerk gasped. One attorney dropped their pen. The boy, still silent, leaned forward. And Boone, his eyes flicked, confused, uncertain. Clara ascended the bench. Not hurried, not dramatic, just certain. She turned, seated herself. And in that moment, before she even lifted the gavel, the balance of power fractured. Boone stood frozen. "Sergeant Boone," she said, voice like steel sliding from a sheath. "Did you just strike me in this courtroom?" Silence again. Except this time, the silence wasn't still. It was building. "I didn't know who you were," he stammered. "That's not what I asked." A new voice emerged, one that hadn't been heard yet today. The courtroom camera clicked on. A red light blinked in the corner. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly. "Answer the question." He hesitated. And in that hesitation, the room began to shift. Reality reasserted itself, not his version, Not the one he'd enforced for decades, but the one that now saw him clearly. Her cheek still burned, but Clara didn't touch it. She let it speak. This was instead just a slap. It was a reckoning, wrapped in routine, finally exposed. And every eye was watching. The courtroom had gone quiet again, but this time it wasn't the fragile hush of protocol. It was a silence loaded with tension, too still, too full. Judge Clara May sat unmoving behind the bench, the imprint of Sergeant Boone's slap still warm on her cheek, but it wasn't pain she felt. Not really, not anymore. It was the memory. A familiar weight pressing down on her chest. Not just from the hand of a man who thought her beneath recognition, but from decades of bearing what people didn't see. She clasped her hands in front of her, fingers laced, knuckles tight. It was the only part of her body that betrayed movement. The gallery watched her, attorneys, officers, a clerk who looked on the verge of tears, but Clara wasn't looking at them. She was looking inward. Down the long hallway of years. She thought of her first case, 3 decades earlier, barely out of law school, defending a 17-year-old black boy, charged with felony assault for shoving a cop during a stop that left him with a cracked rib and no charges filed against the officer. The boy had looked just like the teenager now sitting in her courtroom, small and wide-eyed and not ready for the cruelty that wore a badge and a grin. Back then, Clara had believed that if she worked harder, spoke clearer, proved the law with more elegance, she could fix it. That the system would recognize its own rot and cleanse itself. But the system wasn't sick. It was functioning exactly as designed. She remembered the first time someone forgot her title in court. Miss May, from the bench, after she'd introduced herself as counselor. The judge had blinked when corrected, then smiled as though it were a charming slip. It wasn't. It never was. She remembered the protest letters, unsigned, mailed to her house after her appointment to the circuit bench. One simply read, "Stay in your lane." She remembered the whispered comments in elevator corners, in law firm halls, at charity banquets. She Seps sharp, but intense. She Seps got a chip on her shoulder. You know how they get when they have something to prove. She carried those moments like river stones in her coat, heavy, smooth, polished by repetition, never thrown, just born. And yet Clara had never broken. She had outlasted the smirks, outworked the whispers, outjudged those who swore they'd never say "Your Honor" to a black woman. But today was different. Because this slap wasn't just a microaggression. It wasn't just a misstep in decorum. It was a naked act of power exercised without hesitation. Because Sergeant Boone didn't see a judge. He saw a black woman standing between him and what he thought he controlled. That assumption wasn't born in a vacuum. It had lineage, ancestry. It was inherited arrogance, handed down from every officer who'd filed false reports, every prosecutor who'd buried bad cases, every superior who'd called it a gray area and moved on. Clara was staring that lineage in the face now, and she wasn't blinking. The courtroom remained locked in its breathless awe. Boone stood stiff, as if he still didn't understand the shifting ground beneath him, but Clara did. She had felt that tremor before, quietly, every time she sat in her chambers and reviewed reports that stank of misconduct with no consequences. Every time a complaint vanished, sealed or forgotten. Every time a scared young defendant looked to her for fairness and found only procedure. Clara looked at the teenage boy Boone had brought in. His hands were shaking, clutched between his knees. His lawyer sat beside him, jaw tight, unsure if he should speak, move, or stay utterly still. She would not let this moment be another silent passing. She would not let her silence carry Boone's weight. Clara inhaled deeply, grounding herself not in rage but in purpose. She didn't need her robe to command the room. She didn't need permission to claim her place. What she carried was instead just history. It was power. And power, when tempered by restraint, sharpened by pain, and anchored in justice, became unbreakable. This moment would not bury her. It would crown her. It happened fast. And yet, in memory, it stretched impossibly long, like watching a vase fall in slow motion, knowing the crash will come, powerless to stop it. Sergeant Travis Boone's hand moved before his brain caught up. Open palm. Sharp arc. Contact. The slap echoed across the courtroom like a rifle crack in a canyon. A gasp broke from somewhere in the gallery. Someone whispered, "Jesus." Another dropped a coffee cup, porcelain met tile and shattered, but even that sound seemed distant, dulled beneath the sudden vacuum left by the violence. Judge Clara May stood still, eyes locked on Boone, her face turned just slightly from the force. The skin of her cheek already coloring, her posture unchanged. She didn't stet flinch, didn't stet recoil, didn't stet speak. She simply turned, slowly, and looked him in the eye. And what passed between them in that breathless stillness was older than the law they both claimed to serve. Boone stepped back, half a pace, surprised by his own action, but not ashamed. His mouth curled, the same smirk he'd worn during every arraignment where his testimony twisted facts into fates. The same smile he gave jurors who didn't know the difference between deference and intimidation. "You people," he muttered, "need to learn some respect." The room thickened, like smoke, but colder. Clara's silence wasn't empty. It was orchestral. It carried the voices of every person who had ever been silenced in this place. Every defendant railroaded, every protest ignored, every file closed without a signature. Someone in the back row whispered, "Oh my God," and that whisper, soft, human, terrified, was the first crack in the room's illusion of control. Boone, still puffed with his own authority, pointed a finger. "Why don't you care who you think you are? You don't just walk into my courtroom." His voice froze mid-sentence, as Clara stepped toward the bench. She didn't announce herself. She didn't raise her voice. She walked, one step, then another. The weight of her footsteps fell like drumbeats in a war long denied. The clerk's eyes widened. One of the public defenders shifted in his seat. From the back of the courtroom, the two officers standing against the far wall straightened. One blinked hard, recognizing something Boone had not. The judge was taking her bench. Clara ascended the platform like a slow storm rolling in. She didn't hurry. Dignity never did. She reached the top, turned, and faced him. Not as a victim. As the highest legal authority in that room. And in that silence, more deafening than any gavel, power changed hands. Boone's mouth moved. Words came. But this time, they were laced with something else. Not bravado, not command. Confusion. "Wait, who are you?" He still didn't understand. Clara sat back straight, hands folded in front of her, and then finally, she spoke. Her voice was not raised. It was not angry. It was cold, clear. The voice of stone reshaped by fire. "Sergeant Boone, is this how you treat officers of the court?" A tremor moved through the room. Palpable. Electric. One of the journalists at the back stood up, phone already raised. Boone blinked, his face flushed. "I didn't no, I thought." "That's not what I asked," Clara said. Her eyes didn't leave his. "Did you just strike me in this courtroom?" The boy sitting at the defense table, no older than 16, stared at her like she was some kind of ghost. A guardian he hadn't expected to find in this place. "I didn't know who you were," Boone mumbled. A weak defense. Clara steps, lips barely moved. "And would it have mattered if you did?" He said nothing. But the silence was louder than guilt. The clerk reached for her pen, already writing. A second camera light blinked on in the corner ceiling. Red. Recording. No one moved to stop it. Clara leaned forward slightly. Not to intimidate, to deliver truth. "You assaulted a sitting judge," she said, "in open court, in front of witnesses, on camera." Boone opened his mouth again, but nothing coherent came out. The air had changed. He was realizing it now, too late. He'd stepped off the curb of impunity and landed in a courtroom where someone didn't fear him, where the badge didn't shield, where his usual armor, noise, posture, entitlement, couldn't withstand a gaze that refused to blink. Clara turned her head slowly toward the teenage defendant. The boy hadn't moved, but his eyes, they were different now. They saw her, not just as a judge, as proof. Proof that dignity doesn't flinch when struck. Proof that silence, when wielded correctly, can become a weapon sharper than any insult. The courtroom remained still, tense, waiting. But the line had been crossed, and it would not uncross. The gavel hadn't struck yet. And yet, in every breathless second, judgment was already unfolding. Judge Clara May sat motionless behind the bench, her back straight, her hands resting gently atop one another, not clenched, not trembling, just still, poised, like a monument built not to command attention, but to survive time. The air inside the courtroom had shifted into a rare and reverent quiet, not the silence of hesitation, not the hush of confusion. This was the kind of silence born from witnessing something sacred, when the human soul recognizes that it is in the presence of a truth too large to be denied, too grounded to be ignored. No one moved. The officers at the back of the room had fallen completely still, their postures no longer casual. One of them had his hand, halfway to his radio, frozen in indecision. The clerk had stopped writing. Even the teenager in the defendant's chair had gone utterly still, his hands gripping the wooden arms as if afraid the moment might slip from him. And Sergeant Boone, who had built his entire career on sound and threat and swagger, now stood in a quiet that he did not command. He shifted slightly, like a man suddenly aware of how loud his own breathing had become. Clara didn't speak. Not yet. She let the silence stretch. Let it settle like fog over a field, gentle but obscuring, changing the shape of what everyone thought they knew. This stillness wasn't weakness. It wasn't the absence of reaction. It was a choice. A discipline, a reckoning made with restraint. And that, more than anything, disarmed them all. Even Boone, because he expected rage, resistance, yelling, anything that could be dismissed as emotional, anything that could be deflected, and when it didn't come, when the slap wasn't met with fury but with a terrifying stillness, he didn't know where to place it. Clara finally shifted, barely, a breath, the smallest lift of her chin. That was all, and still, it landed like a declaration. She didn't rise from her chair to chase him. She didn't shout to assert herself. Her power did not need volume. Her presence was enough. Because in this room, this temple of justice too often misused, she was not only the judge, she was the reckoning in human form. For every woman whose step had been doubted, for every black voice that had been overwritten, for every gavel that had struck without fairness, she became still. And in that stillness, she became undeniable. Boone, for the first time, looked down, not at her, but at the ground. It was the first act of surrender. The courtroom did not cheer. No one clapped. Because some moments don't ask for applause. They ask for silence. And then, a single word, cold and even. Sergeant. And the storm, long held in check, began to stir. The silence had done its work. It held, it weighed. And then, like a string pulled too tight, it began to snap. "Officer Mills," Clara said, her voice low, firm, and unmistakable. "Is this courtroom currently under video surveillance?" Her question didn't rise like an accusation. It settled like a certainty. "Yes, Your Honor," Mills answered without hesitation. He stood taller now, no longer unsure of the moment. 2 ceiling units, audio and visual, both active, both recording. "Good?" Clara said, nodding once. She turned her gaze back to the clerk. "Miss Harper, please enter into the official record." Sergeant Travis Boone, acting in his capacity as an officer of the court, did strike a presiding judge in open session, witnessed, unprovoked, and on record. A pen scratched hurriedly. A phone vibrated somewhere. Still, the air didn't lift. Because that sips when it began. A lawyer in the third row leaned to whisper to his colleague, then tapped his phone. One of the journalists in the back, a woman with her hair in a long braid, was already tweeting, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, from urgency, from knowing she was watching a story write itself in real time. In the corner, one of the bailiffs keyed his shoulder radio and murmured something into the line, protocol perhaps, or a quiet call for a superior. It wasn't clear, but what was clear was that the moment had been heard. Not just by those in the room, but beyond it. A call had gone out, not in sirens or shouts, but in the unmistakable cadence of consequence. Across the city, dispatch would log the incident. Screens would flicker. Emails would begin to ping. Officers who'd known Boone for years would pause, phones in hand, unsure how to text him. ADA offices would begin to review old cases, quietly, cautiously. And in a small, high-walled room 4 floors above the courtroom, someone with a title and a budget would glance at a security feed and mutter, "We have a problem." Because Clara hadn't shouted. She hadn't needed to. What she did was worse for them. She named it. On record, in plain language, in full authority. That's what power sounds like when it belongs to the right hands. That's what truth looks like when it's no longer afraid. Boone, still standing, had gone pale. The defiance in his posture was leaking out, inch by inch. He looked, not at Clara now, but at the blinking red lights on the ceiling, small, silent witnesses to everything he thought he could control. This was the call. And though no bell rang, no alarm blared, it moved like a wave through the building, through the system, through the cracks they thought were sealed. Somewhere, someone important had just stood up from their desk. Because Clara May had spoken. And the walls were listening. They thought it might end with a reprimand, a strongly worded memo, maybe even a quiet reassignment for Boone. That was how it had always gone before. But something had shifted. And the people who ran Charleston's halls of power, those who usually doused flames before they became fires, had no idea how fast this one would spread. Clara May had named it. Not in outrage, not in spectacle, in a tone flat and factual, like filing a motion or delivering a sentence. That's what made it dangerous. That's what made it irreversible. By the time she stepped down from the bench that morning, the video had already left the room. It started with a young public defender seated in the back. A quick swipe, a shaky thumb. Her caption, "A judge, struck." In open court, and her silence roared. It spread faster than anyone anticipated. Twitter, Facebook, text messages shared among law students. Screenshots sent from journalist to editor with subject lines like, "Confirm ASAP. This is real?" But while the internet pulsed with reaction, the real unraveling began behind the scenes, in the marrow of institutions that had once seemed too insulated to bruise. At Internal Affairs, a low-level investigator named Rosalind Keene watched the video at her desk 3 times without blinking. Then she picked up her phone, skipped her supervisor, and called a number few in the department even knew existed. By 2:30 p.m., Clara Sipp's office phone rang. "Judge May," she answered, already knowing who it would be. "This is Keene, Internal Affairs. I Sep been watching Boone for 3 years. Never had enough to move. But today you gave me something I can use." Clara exhaled slowly. "Then let Seps use it." By 3 o'clock, a sealed file was delivered to Clara's chambers by hand. Not digitally, not through email. A man in plain clothes knocked once, handed it over, and left without speaking. Inside 5 prior complaints against Boone. All dismissed, all handled by the same ADA. Carson E. Ramsey. All involving excessive force. 2 involving minors, 1 with missing body cam footage. Clara read the summaries. Her jaw set tighter with each line. Then she turned to her bailiff. Carter, I want every case where Boone was lead arresting officer pulled for review. He raised an eyebrow. That sip'll be dozens. Then we still start tonight. At the same moment, across town, in a cramped office above a bail bond storefront, a journalist named Julia Spence was clicking through archived court calendars. She'd covered city corruption before. She knew the signs: missing logs, reassigned dockets, judges recused mid-case without explanation. Her eyes narrowed as a pattern emerged. Boone's name, Ramsey's initials. And Clara's court, too often circumvented. She opened a draft. The Boone pattern, how one officer became untouchable in Charleston's justice system. But her story wouldn't break it first. By 4:45, the Charleston Courier-News had published a headline on its website: "Breaking Judge Struck in Courtroom by Officer," with prior complaints. Underneath, a grainy still from the surveillance camera. Boone mid-motion, hand outstretched. Clara unmoving. The caption read, "This was the moment silence broke." Phones lit up in the mayor's office. The police union issued a prepared statement calling for full transparency and measured response. Measured, as if the system hadn't measured its silence for decades. But the silence was gone now. At 5 o'clock, Clara received an envelope slid under her office door. No return address. Inside, a photocopy of a sealed 2019 case, one she'd never presided over, a juvenile trial. Boone had been the arresting officer. The prosecutor? Ramsey. The verdict? Guilty plea after a missing video submission. No one had asked why the footage was never entered. No one had followed up. Until now. By 6:30 p.m., Clara sat in her chambers surrounded by paper, legal pads, sealed transcripts, printouts of internal memos. Carter stood nearby, watching the storm take shape on her desk. "They're going to fight you," he said quietly. Clara looked up. "They already are." She slid a memo across the desk. At the top, Charleston Police Internal Affairs, request to seal body cam review pending investigation. Underneath, Boone Sepp's badge number. Carter sighed. "They Sepped are trying to contain it." "Let them try," Clara said. Just then, her personal cell rang. A number she didn't recognize. She picked up anyway. "Judge May?" "Yes?" "This is Special Agent Felix Reyes, DOJ Civil Rights Division. We've been tracking Boone through other complaints across state lines. We believe your courtroom incident may trigger federal review." "What do you need from me?" Clara asked. "Names, patterns, paper." "I'd have got more than that," she said. "I'd have got the whole thread." Reyes paused. "Then pull it. Let Seps unravel the whole damn thing." By the time Clara left the courthouse that night, the halls had gone still, but outside, the air buzzed. Protesters had gathered, not in fury, not yet, in witnessing, in presence. They held candles. A few held signs. One read, "We saw, we believe, we will not unsee." The system hadn't collapsed. Not yet. But the cracks were showing. And something was finally leaking through. The door to the holding cell groaned open. Travis Boone looked up, blinking under the flickering fluorescent lights. He hadn't slept. He hadn't been offered a uniform, a belt, or even dignity. Just 4 gray walls, a cold bench, and a camera blinking quietly in the corner, watching him like a ghost he couldn't shake. 2 U.S. Marshals entered first. Federal insignias, unmistakable. One held a set of papers. The other, a pair of soft restraints. Behind them came Agent Rosalind Keene. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She was carrying something worse, purpose. "Sergeant Boone," she said, without ceremony. "You are hereby remanded into federal custody pending a formal indictment. You are being investigated for obstruction of justice, official misconduct, and conspiracy to suppress material evidence. Boonstep's mouth moved. No words came, only air. Keene continued, tone even. You are not being transferred. You are not being escorted to a different jurisdiction. You are being removed. There is a difference. The marshal, with the papers, stepped forward. Sign here if you understand the charges and consent to the transfer. Boone didn't move. Not until Keene leaned slightly forward and said, you can refuse. But I should warn you, the alternative is a press conference on the courthouse steps. And I have your surveillance footage queued up and ready. Boone stared at her, jaw tight. Then he signed. Outside, the storm Clara May had sparked was no longer local. It was federal. At the DOJ field office in downtown Charleston, boxes were being opened, files were being pulled. Clara sat in the center of it all, no longer in her robe, no longer behind a bench, just a citizen, with a memory like a blade and 3 decades of receipts. I want every complaint tied to Boone cross-referenced with drop charges, she told Reyes. Every one that passed through ADA Ramsey Sipp's desk. Agent Reyes nodded, scrolling through files. We Sepp already found 6 with matching patterns. You were right. Same arresting officer. Same prosecutors. Missing body cams. Same judges recusing themselves mid-trial. Clara didn't flinch. Find me the ones that settled in exchange for sealed records. Those are the ones they were afraid to fight in court. Behind her, a printer clattered. Beside her, Carter read through a folder so thick it barely bent. Halcraftoft, Carter said suddenly. The old judge, he signed off on 3 suppression orders in 2018 tied to Boonstep's cases. Clara looked up. Halcraftoft. Her mentor. The man who had once called her the conscience of Charleston law. Now he was a name on a list. They were all names on a list. By nightfall, the walls that had once protected Boone were hemorrhaging. The city council issued a statement. Measured, of course. They took the allegations seriously. They promised an independent review, but the language was already old, worn, useless. Because the reckoning wasn't waiting for permission. It had arrived. At 9:04 p.m., Clara stood on the courthouse steps, floodlights, casting her silhouette long against the pavement. Before her, cameras, microphones, a line of reporters, and behind them, a crowd. Not just protesters, not just supporters, witnesses. I stum not here to make speeches, she began. I stum here to confirm that Sergeant Travis Boone has been taken into federal custody, and that investigations are ongoing, not into one man, but into a pattern. Flashes popped. Phones lifted. The wind carried her voice out across the plaza. A pattern of silence. A pattern of erasure. A pattern of deals made behind locked doors and dismissed with shrugs. That pattern ends now. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Yes, ma'am." A small ripple of applause followed, but Clara didn't smile. This is instead a victory. This is a reckoning, and reckoning means facing everything. The cases buried, the boys charged, the officers promoted, the prosecutors complicit. She held up a file, thin, worn, edges curled. In my hand is one such case. A 17-year-old boy, black, beaten, arrested, forced into a plea deal. The video went missing. His name never made the papers. But tonight, he matters. They all do. The cameras caught it. The crowd felt it. And for the first time in years, the courthouse didn't feel invincible. It felt exposed. Inside, in a sealed conference room, ADA Ramsey stared at the indictment on the table. It bore his name, and Clara's handwriting, firm, neat, unmistakable, was annotated in the margins of the casework. He said nothing. He knew there was no defense left to make. Clara had outlasted them all. And now the system itself stood on trial. The reckoning was instead complete. But it had begun. and it would not be stopped. The courthouse sat quiet. The morning after the storm, its marble steps still wet from an overnight rain. The building hadn't crumbled. The walls hadn't collapsed, but something inside had shifted. Permanently. The people arrived early. Not for a hearing. Not for a trial. But because they needed to see it, proof that the silence had ended. Reporters with notepads. Grandmothers in church hats. Law students with tired eyes and upright spines. Former defendants who had once stood shaking behind podiums in this very room. Survivors, skeptics, and believers. They all stood outside, not shouting, not holding signs, just present. The sun rose slowly over Charleston, warming the columns, the rusted hinges of justice that had too often swung in only one direction. Inside, Judge Clara May walked the halls without her robe. Just her steady stride, her pressed blazer, and a folder in hand. She moved past portraits of men who had ruled over this system long before she ever stepped foot inside it. Names etched in brass, eyes painted with the distance of detached power. But today, those faces watched her. And today, she did not bow to them. Her office was quiet when she stepped inside. The desk was still piled with files, cases reopened, charges questioned, convictions under review. Her resignation hadn't been announced, but the paperwork was prepared, not out of retreat, out of purpose. Because Clara understood something the system never had. Justice doesn't yet end with punishment. It begins with clarity. She stood at the window and looked out over the steps, where the people stood still in the growing light. A young black woman in a red scarf met her gaze through the glass. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just nodded. Clara nodded back. On her desk sat the letter she'd written to the Judicial Review Board. Not a defense, a declaration. The work must continue, it read, but not with hands bound by legacy. I have burned what needed burning. Now someone else must build. Her phone buzzed once. An alert. Boone indicted on 4 counts. She didn't exhale in triumph. She didn't need to, because justice wasn't loud. It didn't always wear robes or bang gavels. Sometimes it whispered in the quiet after. Sometimes it showed up not in courtrooms but in changed hearts and unblinking eyes. That was the gift of aftermath. It revealed what had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. The world had watched a judge get struck. Now, it was watching what happened when she didn't stay down. Clara turned from the window. She had work left to finish. But the world at last was watching. It didn't start with headlines. Not the kind that scream or blink across breaking news banners. It started in quiet rooms, closed offices, low murmurs between colleagues, one question asked in confidence that rippled outward like a drop into still water. What would happen if that judge hadn't stood up? In the weeks that followed Clara May's resignation, Charleston began to shift, not with fireworks, not with parades, with policy drafts, with revisited case files, with people, for the first time, asking aloud what had always been whispered. The city's police review board met with survivors, not behind closed doors, but in open sessions broadcast on local access. They listened. They wrote things down. They stayed. A group of law students from South Carolina State compiled a digital archive. Every dropped complaint, every name that had disappeared under red tape and bureaucracy. They called it the Ledger, and they didn't hide who inspired it. A mural appeared across from the courthouse. Not of Clarisep's face, but of a scale, one side dipped with chains, the other with flame, painted beneath it. Let silence never rule again. In one high school government class, a teacher printed out the transcript from Clara's final hearing. They read it aloud as a civics lesson. When she asked her students what justice meant to them, a girl in the back, barely old enough to vote, raised her hand and said, "It means you keep showing up, even after it hurts." Not every door opened. Not every official fell. Some pushed back harder. Quiet funds flowed to discredit watchdog groups. Clara's inbox still filled with veiled threats. The system does not forget the ones who make it bleed. But the people didn't forget either. One by one, new candidates ran for office, not to be seen, but to see others. And each of them, when asked why they were running, mentioned her name. In a church basement downtown, a former defendant, once processed by Boone, once sentenced by Ramsey, stood before a circle of neighbors and said, "They told me justice would never look like me." But she did. And in the office of a newly appointed judge, a woman barely into her 40s, wearing robes for the first time, Clara's old chair still sat behind the bench. The wood had been polished, the nameplate replaced. But beneath it, inside the drawer, was a note on folded yellow legal paper, left behind and unsigned. Hold the line. Even when it breaks you. Especially then. Change didn't roar. It echoed. Through every hallway that had once swallowed complaint. Through every child who learned their worth from watching someone refuse to shrink. Through every voice that had learned the cost of speaking and spoke anyway. The courtroom hadn't collapsed. It had been reclaimed. And now, even in its silence, it rang. 4.